Right, so in the last video I was talking about how karma, it's not the theory of everything, we're not attempting to do that, and it's not trying to do physics. So in some ways, and it's far more, it's to do with the interconnections of the past and the present, which is far, far more subtle than that. So in some ways, it's far more subtle than anything that we can, that we do in physics. In other ways, it's very much more ordinary. So in this time, I think I'm going to start, we're still talking about this connection with physics, so now, but in a certain sense, it's very much more ordinary than physics. And I think start off with this example that it's actually, rather than saying cause and effects, then when you're talking about karma, you're actually saying something that is so ordinary and so obvious that nobody's going to deny it, I don't think. And it's simply saying that actions have consequences. That's all that the idea of karma is saying in its very ordinary sense. And this is, how can you deny that? You know, if you do things, then they have consequences. And to give an example of how this works, then the Payutto, who's a brilliant Thai scholar, then he's studied the Pali Canon, which is the very earliest of the Buddhist sutras, and it's 16,000 pages that were written down 50 years before the Christian era, and it's a very, very extensive collection that is used in the older Theravadan tradition as the basis of this, as the sutra basis of the teachings. So he's an expert in this. But he's also, there's ideas there are common to all these sutra traditions. And so he came up with this example of karma, trying to explain his understanding that he came from studying the Pali scholars, the Pali Sutras, tried to explain that to a modern audience as best he could. And so he came up with this example of how karma works, of walking up a flight of stairs. And so what are the karmic consequences of walking up a flight of stairs? What are the immediate karmic consequences? Well, when you get to the top of the flight of the stairs, you can no longer touch the ground. So that's one immediate karmic consequence. And another consequence that he mentions is that when you get to the top of the flight of stairs, then you may be a bit exhausted, a bit tired, but somewhat more than you were at the bottom, because you've gone up this flight of stairs. So those are two consequences. And these consequences, they're not, I think it's a very good example to keep coming back to understand how karma works in the ordinary sense, because this is something we can see for ourselves. And then the more subtle things are very hard to understand, and it's easy to put all sorts of fantasies and things into it. But here, in the very ordinary sense, karma is the same in all levels, really. It's just talking about the same kind of idea. That just this very simple, basic idea that our actions have consequences, and there's nobody outside. So if I go up a flight of stairs, there's nobody else who's sort of looking at me and saying, "Oh, this chap, he's gone up a flight of stairs. What an awful thing he's done." So therefore, I'll make it impossible for him to touch the ground. And I'll punish him by making it impossible for him to touch the ground because he's done this horrible thing of going up a flight of stairs. And there's nobody doing that. And there's nobody else also saying, "Oh, he's gone up this flight of stairs, so I'm going to make him a bit exhausted and tired because he's done such a horrible thing." And there's nobody else out there kind of rewarding me. At least Buddhists don't think this. Whether maybe some Christians and others, theists might think this, but certainly Buddhists, and they see no reason for this hypothesis that there's some deity out there making these things happen. And so again, when you get to the top of the flight of stairs, you might get a wonderful view. And again, there's no need to invoke the hypothesis that there's some being out there that's giving you this wonderful view. So I'm not saying there's any problem with people who do think like that. I'm just explaining how the Buddhists think about it. So when you're talking about karma, you're just talking this very simple, straightforward way that when you walked up the flight of stairs, and naturally, because you're at the top, you can't touch the ground. And that's all you're saying. That's the karmic consequence, the immediate karmic consequence. And so there's another thing that we can look at here is that when you're at the top of the flight of stairs, so I'm going to unpack a few other things that from this analogy. It's quite a good one to keep coming back to. So when you get up at the top of the flight of stairs, another thing is that you can't touch the ground. You can't do anything about that by wishful thinking. So you have this kind of hippie idea about all that's needed is positive thinking. and it's become actually people do these courses in positive thinking and so on. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with positive thinking, but this idea that just by having very happy thoughts and beaming out happiness and saying how wonderful everything is and learning to see the world in a very rosy fashion, that's not going to solve everything. Because, for instance, if you're at the top of a flight of stairs, it doesn't matter how much wishful thinking you have like that, how much you try and make the world seem a very happy place and you beam out happy thoughts to the entire world. None of those are going to let you touch the ground when you're on the second floor of the flight of stairs. So there are certain things that you just can't solve by wishful thinking or by positive thinking, you put in another way. So there's nothing wrong with positive thinking, but it won't solve all your problems. And then, so I just dropped something. So then, as well as that, another thing we can unpack from that is that if you're at the bottom of the flight of stairs and you're wanting to go up this flight of stairs, then the actual wish or intention to go up the flight, if you sat at the bottom of a flight of stairs and you think, oh, I'd so like to go up that flight of stairs. Oh, it's so wonderful at the top of the flight of stairs. I really, really must go there. Oh, it's great. Yes. I'm definitely going to go up that flight of stairs. Sometime in my life I'm going to go up that flight of stairs. Maybe I'll go up in the next second. Well, maybe in the next few minutes. Well, sometime I'm going to go up to the very top of that flight of stairs. I very definitely will do it. And you kind of keep on kind of convincing yourself that you're going to do it. You say, I'm definitely, and you just spend all your effort. You want to get to the top of the flight of stairs, and you try to achieve it by just convincing yourself that you're going to do it. And so again, that's not going to get you up there. So no matter how much intention and volitions you have, this is not going to create the karmic effects. So you only get the effects if you actually do the action. And so the way it's taught in Buddhism is that sometimes they make this division into these 4 things that are needed. So you need the intention, obviously. Then you need to do the actual action. But then you need to complete it. So you not just get started going up the stairs, but go all the way up to the top. And then once you're there, you've got to rejoice in the situation you're in. Otherwise, if you go up to the top, then you're very easily disheartened. You just, oh, I can't be bothered. That was such an effort. I'll just go back down again. You've got to, once you've got there, you've got to rejoice and be happy that you're there, and you've experienced the completion of what you've done, and in order to get the full karmic effect. So so that's where we are. So karma, and so then this is the immediate the way karma works on the immediate level, and I don't think you can even deny that. So people start saying, oh, Buddhists should stop believing in karma because it's such a strange idea. Well, you can't stop believing it, not in this ordinary sense. It's absolutely obvious to everyone that actions do have consequences. So in this very ordinary sense, it's just saying something that's so obvious, so plain as daylight, that there's no point even trying to deny it. So it's just absolutely obvious that actions do have consequences. And that really is all it's saying. But it's also saying that on longer and longer timescales as well, that they don't just have immediate consequences, but they have longer term consequences. And so that's when it starts to get a little bit more subtle. But these are still things that you can actually see in this lifetime. You don't need to be a Buddha to see these things. So these other somewhat more longer consequences, then one example is that if you tell lies, for instance, well, obviously it has an immediate karmic effect, immediate effect that you tell the lies and you start telling these lies, you might get stressed, the sort of things that they see in the lie detector when you actually as a result of actually saying this and putting these words out into the world that you know are untrue. But it all depends very much on the intention. So and people, when I was talking just back then about intentions, people sometimes read some of the sutras and the Buddha's teachings saying, talking about the importance of intention and how intention colours everything. And there's a tendency to sometimes think that means the intention causes karmic effect. But I mean, he's talking all the time, although he doesn't actually sometimes sort of go into elaborate it very much. But it's always talking about intentional actions whenever you're talking about karma, you're talking about actions. So it's how intentions colour your actions, and that's why they keep talking about intention, because always in the context of actions, things that take you somewhere, so things that you have to actually be going somewhere, and moving to a new situation in some way, for it to be karma. And things that are going on in your mind, that's just habits of mind, and it's a different kind of thing from karma. And so then these longer term effects, then if you lie, and if you lie with a good intention, then for instance, if you take Kant's famous example of the mad axe murderer, so you're in the village, and then as you're walking along the village, you suddenly see a chap come rushing down the street, and he disappears. He turns off to the right, say, and running as fast as he can. Joe Bloggs, who you know. And then there's another chap who comes rushing along, and he says, "Have you seen Joe Bloggs?" And you see this chap, and he's got a ferocious expression on his face. He's waving an axe, and he's saying, "Have you seen that horrible chap, Joe Bloggs?" He's waving this axe, and he's obviously, he's obviously out to murder Joe Bloggs. Then, if you've got reasonably quick-witted and sensible, then you will say, "Oh yes, I saw him. He went that way," and you probably say he went off to the left, the street to the left, and you say, "Tell the mad axe murderer to go that way." And so this chap then, he'll go rushing off up to the left, and hopefully by the time he actually eventually catches up with Joe Bloggs, either Joe Bloggs has got away or he's calmed down a bit. So that is a lie in a very it's a kind of it's a white lie, what we call a white lie. But your intention was very good, and you're only telling this lie in order to help both the axe murderer and the chap he was chasing after. You're helping both of them by doing this. So you had this, but this very good intention, and that has very limited effect, long-term karmic effect, and mainly that entire situation, very good positive effect in the future. So, but where lies become a problem is if you start telling particularly lies told with deceit, an intention, for instance, to claim something that doesn't belong to you, and so you tell a lie in order to establish your own claim when you know it doesn't belong to you. But you say, yes, that's mine, that definitely was mine. And you maybe say in a court of law that this thing that, this house is definitely my house, or this is definitely my car, or whatever it is that you're trying to lay claim to. And you say that in a court of law, and you swear to the judge that, so-and-so gave it to you or whatever. And so if you do something like that, then that's very harmful. And so the harm you can immediately see the harm. Of course, you get stressed out, and you're having to spot these lies that you know are not true, and immediate repercussions on you. But there's also a much more subtle and difficult thing to see, which is that whenever you tell a lie like that, with especially lie intent to deceive other people, and then so they say, then this makes you kind of disconnection with the truth, because at that moment. So it's different if you're telling lies for entertainment in fiction. It's not really a lie. That's sort of imagining things, and your actors saying things that they don't believe, but they say them because their character in the story that they're acting out believes it. In the method acting, they actually might go through all the kind of emotions of feeling what it's like to be a murderer, for instance, because that's who they're acting if you're doing method acting. And so all of that, then that's not telling a lie, not in this sense. You're not acting in order to deceive. You're acting in order. You're just doing these things in order to entertain, and to educate, and to help people. So when you actually truly, and so fiction writers writing books, the same thing. But if you actually say something with intention to deceive and intention to harm other people, then that's the time when you're actually making a disconnection with reality. You try and convince other people and yourself, because it's the only way you can be really convincing, that this thing is true, which you know is false, or this thing is false, which you know is true. And so that has a harmful effect, and that's the more subtle thing, where you can begin to see how every time you tell a lie, then you are making a kind of disconnection. When you tell a lie to other people, it's not to do with how you're thinking and mistakes you make, and certainly not to do with making mistakes, but it's to do with deliberately deceiving people. Then each time you do that, you're getting a little bit more disconnected with the truth. And especially for a practitioner on the path, you're wanting to connect to the truth. And you get people who tell lots and lots of lies, then they can get to the point in which they actually lose. We talk about people being a little bit shifty, it's sort of this kind of related to this idea that they've told so many lies that they no longer very clear themselves as to what of all the things that they say are actually true. They've kind of lost sight of what's true and what isn't. They just have lots and lots of stories. They kind of flip between depending on who they're talking to. So that's one of the effects of lying. And so this is the effect in this lifetime, but if we have continuous awareness continuing into future lifetimes, of whatever it is that comes after you die, so you don't need to think in whatever it is that comes next, then there's the idea that this is also continuing in that way as well. So, and then the Buddhist teaching that the longer term effects are even more serious than the ones that we can see in this lifetime. And so this advice that it really is good to be kind of careful about telling the truth if you can. And more positively, actually telling the truth is connecting you to the truth and to understanding the truth. So you're more easily deceived if you tell lies, and you're more easily able to see what the true situation is if you tell the truth. So that's that. And then another thing that's very like that is anger and angry actions, and actually harming others and deliberately harming other people. So it's not the arising of anger in your mind. It's when you turn that into action and actually do things that are actually harmful and intentionally harming them, and more so if you actually plan this out over a long period of time and you work out how to get your revenge on them or whatever in some kind of very detailed and complicated fashion, and that sort of thing, and just very strong intent, and then you achieve it, and then when you achieve it, you're very pleased that you've achieved it. Then that sort of thing that also is similar to the lying. That creates a very hard-edged world, very sharp edges. That when you start putting that sort of energy out into the world, and then what comes back is this very sharp-edged kind of world we're in. So this chap who got savaged by a marauding cow that I was talking about in the last video, in the very first video, then we all are vulnerable in that way, and that's due to this kind of, in the past we've done things that have made this very sharp-edged world that we're in. And so that's the karmic effects of anger and lying, and you can go into all the other ones, and in this, please bear in mind, in all of this, my understanding is very limited. I'm not trying to do a Buddhist teaching here. All I'm talking about here is try to understand how this relates to these urban legends and why Buddhists don't think in these terms. And if you're interested, eventually there are loads and loads of videos by good Buddhist teachers if you want to follow these things up and find out more about all this stuff. So I'm not really trying to do the teachings except just touch on them. And so that's the idea of the anger, and so then if you can actually purify this anger in this lifetime, and even if you've done something absolutely terrible, maybe you're a serial murderer and you've killed half a dozen people or more people than that in a deliberate, intentional way in this lifetime, you can still purify that. And so in this lifetime, and you can't deal with all the karmic effects, but you can deal you can deal with, and in fact you can go so far as you can actually reach nirvana in the same lifetime as you actually killed lots of people as a serial murderer. That's perfectly possible in the Buddhist teachings. So you can purify all that past karma, and then you can reach nirvana. And there's an actual teaching in Sutra of this chap who was a serial murderer, and he'd killed 999 people, so the story goes, and he killed them just in order to get hold of their little finger. So you can go and read the story and find out details of why he did it and how it all happened. And then the 1,000th person, which was he set out to get 1,000 little fingers. That was his task. So at the end, the 1,000th person was the Buddha. So he was setting out and he was going to kill the Buddha. And the Buddha managed to set up this situation where he found it impossible to kill him. And then this got him thinking. And then so there's a little bit of sutra about that. And it's the way it's written, some of the sutras, it's this it's really quite difficult to actually understand in Western ways of thinking, or modern ways of thinking, not just Western, modern scientific ways of thinking. But the message behind the story is very clear. That this chap was he was a serial murderer, and he tried to kill the Buddha, and then when he failed killing the Buddha, and the Buddha gave him this teaching, then he turned his life around, and then at that point he made a very firm vow that he was never going to kill anyone again, and he became a Buddha, and he became a monk. He took the monk's vows, and all of them, one of which of course is not killing, and he kept that vow very, very clearly through the rest of his life, and he never did kill anyone, and he and eventually he reaches nirvana in that lifetime. He has a realization, and he reaches nirvana. But on his way there, there's a rather nice story on his way there before that, which again it's more the idea behind the story than whether you actually believe it actually happened like this, because they again had this different way of thinking about things. But the idea that you can actually bless and help people through having done good things in your own life, then even people are suffering, then you can actually, even if they've got some ailment or something, the idea you can actually help them in some way, sort of healing presence. So they had this idea that so there was this woman, there was a lady who was giving birth, and she was having a problematical birth, and they were both at great risk of dying. And he comes up, and through his blessing, that he's, because of all this, keeping his vow of not killing, since he met the Buddha, then he was able to help here, so the lady was able to have an easy birth. And so you can imagine how he must have felt at that point, having killed all these 999 people, and now being able to assist and with his blessing because of his keeping his vows so clearly. And then eventually he reaches nirvana. So that is absolutely possible, that you can purify your past karma in this lifetime. Even dreadful things you've done during this life. So what else was I going to talk about? Oh yes, I think I'm just going to touch on, I'll continue on this idea of karma as physics and how it isn't really. That the Buddha also, he taught about how that there's this tendency for people to say, oh, what were you in your past life? As soon as you start thinking about past and previous lives and future lives, you start saying, oh, were you this, or were you that, or were you another thing, and I guess that I was this, and I guess that I was that, or whatever. And the Buddha taught that is a very unproductive way of thinking. And so I talked about before how we have this idea that what the Buddha taught was that we have this illusion of a self, that there actually is a self there that's been continuing on and on, and that is the fundamental confusion, the source of all our problems. And this is something that it's actually this self that we have, this view that I have a self, it's actually something I'm actively maintaining all the time. So I'm continually saying to myself, although I don't even realise I'm doing this, yes, I'm there, yes, here I am, yes, I'm, and then you sort of lapse a bit and you sort of wonder if you are there, yeah, of course I'm here, yes, I am there, myself, I can see myself, yes, I'm probably, and yes, there it is again. You're continually saying that, continually maintaining this idea of yourself from one moment to the next, in a very strong, very, very strong way. And Buddha talk about the kind of a builder, like a builder building a house. You're continually building up this image of that there is this illusion of the self. And so when they talk about the teachings on non-self, well, the way the Buddha taught is that he's seen through, and his house has collapsed, and the rafters have fallen apart, and the builder's never going to build a house again. And so that's in the sense of what realizing non-self is about. And so the people, when they're trying to understand non-self, they often get this idea that there's something you've got to try and eradicate, but it's not actually, that self is not actually there at all in the first place. So there's nothing that you have to eradicate. There's something you continue building up, but there's nothing. It's like if what's the point in trying to eradicate something that's not there. This illusion of self, and you think, so the thing you're building up in all this building is this illusion of self. So some people think, oh well, what I've got to do is to try and find the self and eradicate it, and somehow destroy the self. And but the problem isn't the self; it's rather the builder than the self. So if you try and think about it, if you could try and eradicate the self, if you could eradicate it, then that means there's something there to be eradicated. So how can you eradicate the self if it's not there? It doesn't make sense, does it? And what's more, if you try and eradicate the self, then who is doing that eradicating? So really some kind of project to try and get rid of it is obviously not going to work. And then another idea that comes up is, well, it's like a kind of belief or a creed. I've got to convince myself that I haven't got a self. And so every morning I will say 10 times, I don't have a self, I don't have a self, I don't have a self, I don't have a self. Say that 10 times, and eventually you'll believe it. But first of all, if it's not there, then what's the point of trying to convince yourself that it's not there, if it's not there anyway? And then, as well as that, if you do manage to believe that you don't have a self, well, who is it who's doing that believing? So, both of these ideas, they just reinforce it even more strongly. And the way it's taught is, it's more like, if you imagine that you had so suppose you discovered that you're holding a red hot coal in your hand, it's burning your hands, and you've been holding it for a very long time, and you didn't even know it was there. As soon as you realise, you'd instantly drop it. You wouldn't even have to stop and think. So that's the sense that when you realise that you've been maintaining this illusion of self and all the, what the ramifications of it all are, then at that point there's no problem, and you will just drop it and it'll just fall away, and so they say. So on the way there, you can have these kind of glimpses of non-self, where you start thinking, you just get a kind of idea of what it is, a kind of very little glimpse. And some people make this mistake of trying to build up those glimpses into kind of continuous feeling of, I don't have a self. And if you manage to do that, and if anyone says, I realise non-self, I've got it, then ask yourself, who is it who's realised that? How does that make sense? So that's a kind of trap that meditators can sometimes get into. But it's an idea you can't actually achieve it from yourself. It has to, in some sense, come from outside. It feels as if it's coming from outside, because it's not your ordinary self that can realise these things. And it's not something external either, but it's external of your ordinary self. So anyway, the Buddha taught that if you try and work out who you were in your previous life, then that is this kind of methods of investigation and trying to understand the karma in that sense. And you're not Buddha, you're just trying to work out, what was I in my previous life. Then when you're doing that, that is trying to trace back the self and you have this very concrete linear idea, in this life and then in the previous life and the previous life, and try and work out. And he says all you're doing there is is another way of continually maintaining this illusion that you have a self, and you're kind of strengthening it and reinforcing it. And he strongly advises not to try and do that sort of thing. Not to try and speculate about who you or what you really were, or what kind of being you really were in your previous life. And so that's, again, it's a kind of advice that's don't try and treat it as physics, and don't try and work everything out, because that's not productive or helpful. So they take this differently in the various different Buddhist traditions. But for instance, in Zen Buddhism, then the result of this is they don't really think very much about past and previous lives too much at all. It's very much in the moment kind of way of looking at Buddhism, and they don't have elaborate ideas about how karma works. Now, if you go to and so this is maybe quite the easiest to relate to, maybe in some ways as a Westerner, because it's not much very different from this just the actions of consequences that we can see so easily in our ordinary life. And they say, just sort of this goes forward into the future beyond when I die. And it's really quite easy to appreciate that. And then you certainly don't need to be a Buddha to see that much, and to say, well, there's obviously actions and consequences in this life, and what about future lives, and or whatever happens when I die if it's not another life. And in the other extreme, in Tibet, they have very elaborate ideas about how even the exact process of how you go from one life to the next. And of course they have these reincarnate tulkus, and in entire streams of one after another. And they say that Dalai Lama is the 14th Dalai Lama. And but even in these ways of looking at it, it's much more fluid in a way than you might think. It's sometimes presented in a very simple way, but it's not as simple as that. So particularly when they're going from one life to another, then there's no sense at all that it's the same kind of person, character, it's the same type, that this 14th Dalai Lama was the same kind of person as the 13th and the 12th and so on. Not at all. And one example is that the 14th Dalai Lama, then he's very interested in the sutras and the Tibetan traditions. The Tibetan have this great wealth of sutras. It's like, if you imagine all the works of literature, the great works of literature that we have in English, imagine that in Tibetan, but it's all about Buddhism, all about the Buddhist teachings. So they have a vast collection of literature in Tibetan, and he got very interested in that, and so he became he's a very good scholar, very understanding the teachings, and as they're written down in the Tibetan canon and the later Tibetan works. And he also is got very good at debating at it, and famed for his debating skills for these things. But the earlier Dalai Lamas, for instance the 6th Dalai Lama, he wasn't interested in this at all. He just he couldn't wait to be finished with his required scholarly studies, and instead he became a poet, and apparently he wrote very good famous poet, very good poetry in Tibetan, which the Tibetans still appreciate to this day. So he's one of his great poets of the past, like Howard Blake or Milton or whatever. He was one of those. And so you can have very different characters from one reincarnation to the next. And so then, as well as that, then it's actually much more fluid, the idea that it's the kind of continuous sort of awareness from one life to another, but it's more like, it's not really so linear as we're thinking about, because you don't have the idea of an Atman or soul in Buddhism. So there isn't the idea that it's a single thing that somehow goes from one life to another. So there's just more that this awareness that I have now is going to continue endlessly into the future. But for instance, and one thing that's very difficult for Westerners to understand, is that one person can get reborn as several people, for instance, and in the Tibetan traditions. So I'm not sure what the other traditions say about it, but very definitely in Tibet, then they say that one person can be reborn, for instance, as 3 people in their next life. It's quite rare, but when they go and look for a reincarnation from a previous life, then sometimes they find that they get 3 reincarnations instead of just 1. And then this is where it gets really weird and quite difficult to understand in Western eyes. Then these tulkus will say, and one of them, they'll be identified as being the reincarnation of the body in the previous life. Another one is the reincarnation of the speech in the previous life. And then the other one is the reincarnation of the mind in the previous life. So what do you make of that? So some tulku will say, oh, he's the reincarnation of the speech of so-and-so in his previous life. So it is really very much more fluid, and it's not at all this kind of strict way that Westerners kind of think about it. So that's the rebirth, and so karma is also within that context as well. That there isn't really a single linear sort of soul that's going along that is creating these things and then experiences their consequences. Not quite in that way. There's continuation of awareness, there's continuation activity now, and the activities leading to consequences in the future, and there's interconnection of the past and the future and through the present and so on. And so anyway, you can relate to as much or as little of that as you like, but the very basic idea of karma is this very, very simple idea that anyone can see, that our actions have consequences. And basically what the Buddha is teaching to start with, you can actually just start with that as well, as thinking, just try to think a little bit more about the longer term consequences of your actions. Then that's heading you in the direction of what the teachings on karma are about. So I'm just I'll do a little bit more, another video. I'll stop here.